I remember a time when civil society basically meant NGOs, church groups, and the media. How has that definition evolved?
Yeah, I think that's basically the problem that we try to unpack in the book, that many governments actually view civil society as NGOs. And that narrow definition of the term civil society and what it entails restricts them to viewing and putting everyone in one basket. And so when they put in place laws that govern NGOs, everyone else that falls within civil society gets affected. But I think over the years, the classical definition of civil society has been one that is fluid and nebulous, referring mainly to that which is not the state or the family. But today, I think there are various categories of civil society, and I think in simpler terms, civil society will encompass what we call the third sector, and that includes your business associations, churches, as you said, faith groups, NGOs as one part of civil society, foundations, and increasingly groups like the Bill and Melinda Gates and so forth and so on. All those form what we call civil society. And of course, civil society in its own entails civility, and that has tended to, in many ways, leave out groups that are found in Africa, for example, client-patron relationships, social movements, and so forth and so on. And yet all these form a constellation of what we term civil society.
Where does business fall within this spectrum? Because, you know, again, in terms of those narrow definitions, you would look at the work of civil society being anything that has to do with advancing the constitution and human rights, welfare associated type projects. The running of the economy isn't really regarded as the mainstream activity of civil society, and yet increasingly business is starting to straddle the social welfare aspect in as much as the economic aspect.
Yeah, I think that to be fair, we should recognize that for any development to take place, there's got to be people, and civil society represents the people. And so in many ways, what we talk about these days is the public-private partnerships. And that's where you would find that, in fact, it's a misnomer to consider civil society's role to be only that which is relegated to politics or social issues. We are seeing lots and lots of progress that is made by civil society, both in terms of economic development. In fact, in many countries, if you look at the contribution of civil society, there are studies that are being carried out across the world that show that the contribution of civil society, the non-profit sector, to the GDP of countries is far much ahead of some of the economic sectors like agriculture, like social affairs, and so forth and so on. So it's a multi-billion-dollar industry on its own. So in terms of employment, in terms of so many inputs, civil society on its own contributes to economic development. But there are various levels at which it does that. I think one is to be a simple watchdog on making sure that states deliver on the promises and become democratic governments. In many countries, what we're seeing is a democratic deficit. And once you have that and you don't have civil society on the watch, you are not going to get economic development.
In the world we live in today, the greatest irony is that we come from a semi-laissez-faire economy situation where leave the economy to the devices of the market, and now the state is back, bailing out banks, defining the parameters for regulation, insisting on how jobs should be created, when they should be created, all those kinds of issues. Is the state starting to encroach too much?
Well, I think that to put that into perspective, in the 80s and so on, we saw that the World Bank and many others, in fact, wanted the state to roll back. And I think that was a mistake. And what we are seeing now is that the markets have failed, and the state too is failing. And so we are beginning to hear people talking about the third sector first. And that means we need to allow civil society, we need to allow people and various movements to have an enabling environment under which they should operate. If the space is restricted, including business enterprises, they will not be able to perform their roles. I think what we are seeing currently is that the space is shrinking for civil society, for the media, and so forth and so on, because those are seen in many ways as the breeding space for the opposition. But I can assure you that in the next few years to come, if business continues bankrolling parties for elections, they are also going to be restricted. And so this should not be seen only as the governments encroaching into the space of civil society and citizens. It's encroaching into the whole spectrum of development, and development is a process and not an event.
What's the role of civil society in fostering economic development?
I think there are various levels at which civil society can play a role. We saw that during the negotiations around the economic partnership agreement, civil society played a very leading role in partnering with many intergovernmental institutions like COMESA, like ECOWAS, and many others. So there is that level at which civil society can play a leading role internationally and otherwise, both in terms of capacity building, in terms of the think tank role that many groups are playing now, especially in the field of economic governance, where for many years we have never developed, I think, expertise, and we're seeing so many groups that are developing expertise in that. So there's that level at which internationally and locally civil society can provide those skills. But the second level, a number of people who are employed in many countries, they're actually employed by civil society groups, whether they're think tanks, they're foundations, or just social movements. And I think civil society provides employment. I think the third level at which we're seeing the role of civil society in contributing towards economic development, and economic development here should be seen as sustainable, equitable, and shared, is the role of advocacy. And only citizens in their various formations can play that role. And so I think what we are trying to say in the book is that the space for assembly, this place for association and freedom of expression should be broadened beyond just civil society to a number of players in the economy.
Okay, Andrew, your views on this one, the role of civil society in economic development, and the fact that in the world we live in today, we've almost swayed the pendulum to the other side, where we've moved from a limited role for the government to now a more definitive role for the government in economic activities.
Sure, and I think one of the reactions specifically with when it comes to the public out there is this disengagement that we talk about. You see how insular people can be in terms of private healthcare, private education, private transport, and political apathy. And I think civil society has to bridge that gap, because there is a role to play in terms of skills transfer, as you mentioned, in terms of governance being one of the big ones, and it's something that potentially we aren't seeing at the moment, and it needs to be addressed.
I think you're raising an interesting point, and we'll just bring it to South Africa and what we've seen recently. I heard on a radio station that 5 years ago there were about 4 service delivery protests in year 2005. Fast forward and we're looking at over 200 protests in the last year alone. The voice of the public in demanding basic social goods and services like healthcare, like education, has grown vociferously.
Yeah, I think in the chapter on South Africa that is written by Siphamandla Zondi, he does actually allude to that point, that what civil society has done is firstly to build public awareness of the rights and responsibilities of citizens. And that can only be done by voter education, responsibilities that civil society and some of the groups that do that are currently viable in this country and in many other countries. So I think that's the first level at which we should look at civil society and this role in the broader community. But the second level is that, we saw with so many issues, for example, the arms shift that was supposed to go to Zimbabwe, it was trade unions and civil society organizations that managed to stop that. And so I think there's a time at which no other entity other than civil society can raise some of these issues. And so the delivery protests that you see in many countries are actually a function of the awareness and a function of the role that civil society plays.
What are the trends we're seeing across Africa? I mean, your studies go from DRC to Uganda to Ethiopia.
Yeah, I mean, the first volume that we did, we were concerned about the shrinking space for civil society and its various formations. If you look at all those countries, they are notorious for enacting laws that instead of enabling the environment for development, they actually disenable the public sphere, and hence the title that we have. So Ethiopia was actually one of the countries that in many ways was discussed internationally for putting in place a law that was going to cripple civil society. But you see that across all the countries that are in that book. So some of the emerging trends are that civil society and political society just before the independence, these were groups that worked together. You fast forward to the one-party state, civil society began going underground simply because the one-party state did not want any opposition or dissenting voices. What we have currently is a situation where we talk of democratic states, where multipartyism is taking place and so forth and so on. And yet what you see are contradictions of democracy. Where democracy thrives, you have more groups coming up challenging the state, challenging some of the actions of business and so forth and so on. And that on its own invites attention.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned this, because this takes us back, Andrew, to this whole question of what approaches Africa in general needs to pursue in its economic evolution. If you follow the Asian approach, it's a strong state. It's often the state directing the path of investment and then growth. If you follow the classical model, leave it to the markets, you do see growth, but you see huge inequalities. What should Africa be doing? Following the Chinese model of development, where democracy hopefully comes after the economic development, or vice versa?
Well, I think, as Becky quite correctly says, is you have to reconcile this with what we've just gone through in terms of the financial crisis, where you had your typical classical model where private business was left to its own devices to a large extent. Regulation was kept to an absolute minimum, and the result of it has been painful for all. On the other side of things, when you move to sort of state direction, if you look in, let's say, a South African context, if you look at the success of certain parastatals and where we sit at this point in time, it's also maybe not the answer. So somewhere of a hybrid between the two is probably the direction that one would look at. You look at the Chinese type of model, and whilst you might say it's heavily state directed, there is a lot of private business involved in that. Yes, it's directed, but they certainly do leverage off skills. They certainly do take direction from the market itself.
Okay, thanks so much to you, Dr. Bhekinkosi Moyo, who's with the Southern Africa Trust and is also the editor of this book, Disenabling the Public Sector, Civil Society Regulation in Africa, with a foreword by Grasa Michelle.